There was an interesting development with Jey Uso on this week's edition of Raw, and it actually came via multiple segments. Like, there were a couple things that stood out with Jey. He had the match against Finn Balor and got the victory there in that one, and was able to kind of, get out of the arena and met Sami Zayn at the entrance and all that stuff. Great visual, great presentation, I thought, to get there. But there are some things that happened before that I think are important. You had Jey come out, after Cody welcomes him out, and Cody wants to be Jey's backup, but Jey reiterates that he has to do this himself, right? He's main event Jey Uso. He's in this incredible sort of singles run in his career. Just came off of a WrestleMania win, which we'll get to, and all that. But he also had a backstage interview, right, where he had to be asked about what happened on SmackDown, which was the beatdown from the new Bloodline, the Rogue Bloodline, whichever Bloodline Wolfpack, whichever one you want to call them, Solo Sikoa and Tama Tonga, as they took out Jimmy, effectively throwing him out of the current iteration of the Bloodline. And, you had Paul Heyman checking on him. You kind of have the intimidation factor with Solo and Tama Tonga talking about the orders of the tribal chief, their tribal chief, which we know is different than the one Paul Heyman is referring to, at least we think so. And now you've got, though, a setup where Jey responds, and what does he say? Jey just says, when you go down, that road with the bloodline, I think specifically what he says, messing with the bloodline is going down a dark road. You get that hesitation from Jey. He's like, he knows that it's a dark road when you go down that. But it was important that he brought that up because we know he's going to have to go back down that road. And why is that? Because of what he said afterwards, which was, you could tell there was kind of that, it was trying to pull Jey, it's trying to pull everything out of Jey to make him not go as far as he wants to go. But he just says, man, I told Jimmy to come with me. I told him. And you just sort of had that frustration come out with Jey, but it's not just frustration. It's that caring for his brother. The one who, yes, he just defeated at WrestleMania 40 after this intense rivalry the two had. And yes, the one that he speared off the stage, that same brother, right? And it's still, though, now a situation where, and you guys know I've given my thoughts on this right after SmackDown on Friday. I think you are inevitably setting up the scenario where Jey has to now figure out what's next. And ultimately, I think what's next is you get Roman Reigns and the Usos back together whenever Roman returns to take on this new formidable foe, which just happens to be the other part of the bloodline with Solo, Tama Tonga, and the expectation is that you're going to get the debuting Jacob Fatu. But that's where things get interesting with Jey, because Jey has his title match against Damian Priest at Backlash. We know that. It's official. That's where the match is going to take place. And Jey has, as we said, told Cody he wants to do this by himself. But he also said, what? He talks about going down the road with the bloodline as a dark road. Could we see a scenario, and I've seen many people bring this up, both in the live streams and in the comments on videos, is this where Jacob Fatu makes his debut and costs Jey Uso the championship? Because we know it's not going to be Jimmy that cost Jey this time. It seems like time after time it was Jimmy costing Jey these opportunities. It's not going to be Jimmy this time around, because he's either selling the beatdown or Jimmy's back to sort of thinking about, where do I go from here? So is that where you see the big debut for Jacob Fatu and he costs Jey the title? That brings Jey back into the bloodline, whether he wants to be in it or not, which he's made it very clear he doesn't want to go back down that dark road. He wants to do everything he can to stay out of it. But that would force him back into it, just as this first step has somewhat forced him to think about getting back into this whole thing with the bloodline. Just when he thought he was done, he finishes things with his brother. He's main event Jey Uso on Raw. He's away from it all, finally. But then everything changes when they attack his brother. And so is this what they do? There's one option, right? Fatu interferes, costs Jey the title. He has no choice to go after his revenge. And then if that is the case, what could happen? Well, the draft's coming up. Do you get Jey potentially drafted to SmackDown, where now he's back with everything else? And I know there's going to be some pushback to that if that happens, because I think some people have been fine with seeing Jey kind of on his own, being by himself, and doing this main event Jey Uso singles run, and feel like there's a lot maybe you can still get out of that. Although, if you're challenging for the world title, it's kind of the height of this, right? I mean, you're challenging for the world championship again. And so this is really could be like that last step in that big singles run, and maybe that's where eventually we get these two back together as the Usos, and they're teaming again. So it's not a perfect solution, I think, either way. But if he gets drafted to SmackDown, that forces him right back into everything with the Bloodline, which would be a little more fresh this time because you have different people you're working against. It's not the same story. There'd be some significant differences. And if that happens, is it Jey who tries to go head first into battling Solo, battling Tama Tonga, battling Jacob Fatu potentially, and then that's where Jimmy makes his triumphant return to save his brother? That's one possible scenario, right? That could be next in this whole Bloodline saga, is you could see it play out that way. Or is there something else that happens? Or does Jimmy be the one who, Jimmy just got attacked, he wants his revenge, he goes after these guys, and maybe we don't get Jacob Fatu just yet. And maybe, though, Jimmy decides to go after Solo, goes after Tama Tonga, we see what's going on here. There's a numbers disadvantage for Jimmy. He needs someone to help him. And maybe Jey is the one who's forced to make that decision. Do I stay or do I go? Do I stay out of this whole business with the Bloodline, just like I said I know I need to, or do I jump back into this because that's my brother and I got to help him? Either way you go here, I think you've got a lot to work with, especially with Jey, because you're forcing Jey now to make a decision on what he does next after everything he's been through with his brother. As we said, it's still his brother. And could we see these two reunite back together, and the Usos are part of this whole storyline now again because they have no choice. They are part of the Bloodline, right? Maybe not this version of the Bloodline. They don't want to have anything to do with this version except for kicking their asses. They don't want anything to do with being on the side on whatever Solo's doing, whatever Tama Tonga's doing, and ultimately we expect it to be Jacob Fatu, which, of course, I've made my prediction. The tribal chief for Solo, Tama Tonga, Jacob Fatu may ultimately be revealed as The Rock. He may be the person who's pulling the strings here because we pointed out in other videos leading up to WrestleMania 40 how there's clearly more of a connection now between The Rock and Solo, and you kind of see how it's all played out. And then that's where you get sort of a complete flip of this dynamic, where all of a sudden it's Roman Reigns and the Usos are the ones who are being cheered. They're the ones who are back to save the Bloodline. That's my theory. That's one prediction, right? There's a lot of ways you could go with this, but I think it's so fascinating how they've done this because we did think that this was maybe it. Like, you break off the Usos. We said we don't know what you do with Jimmy after he loses that match, gets speared from Jey. Jimmy's taking a beating here. You don't know what you're going to do with Jimmy in a singles action because it's not been the same as Jey, right? Jey has been the one that's flourished in the singles run, whereas Jimmy's just he'd still played the sidekick to Roman Reigns. And so this is an opportunity, though, to where you bring both back still in a pretty strong spot together because now they all have reasons for it, right? They have reasons to come back together. They have a reason to actually want to fight for each other instead of fighting each other. And I think that's important here because you've set up a lot of interesting directions you can go to get back to the Usos. There's multiple tag team combinations you can work with there. You can have the tag matches, against the Solo and Tama Tonga, against, Solo and Fatu, Tama Tonga and Fatu. Like, you have multiple combinations to work with until you get Roman Reigns back, which, for me, I feel like it makes a lot of sense to get Roman back by SummerSlam for that six-man tag there, maybe. Or maybe they hold that off because, as we said, too, you still have singles matches to do. Roman and Solo, Roman and Fatu, Roman and Tama Tonga, they may do all iterations of it. But you see my point here is that because you have so many fresh matchups to play with, how they introduce Jacob Fatu, how they decide to get Jimmy back to Jey, whether that is through the draft or whether that is, trying to get retribution on whatever happens to him in this championship match against Damian Priest, if that's the way they go, or maybe Jey just loses straight up. I don't think that's going to happen. But there again are a lot of scenarios to where you've got to get these two back to each other at some point. And I know there's going to be, like I said, maybe some criticism of that right now because Jey is still doing a lot of good things in a solo run, no pun intended. But you can still do Jey Uso singles matches, right? Even if you have him back with Jimmy. And maybe this is one where, hey, they come back together and they try to get out of this bloodline thing, which it just keeps sucking them back in. And I think that's the whole point now is They are forced to make a decision. Jey Uso has to make a decision. Jimmy Uso has to make a decision. And will it lead to both of them coming back together to avenge the other, perhaps, based on how this plays out, and move forward with the Usos back as one? And then maybe we get that huge pop when Roman Reigns comes back, 3-on-2 scenario. Roman evens the odds, and you get the day one originals, as was coined in our comment section on one of our live streams, coming back together for the big blow-off between the new bloodline and the old bloodline. So there you go. There's some thoughts on what Jey had to say on Raw, because I do think it's important as we start to see this development for Jey's character moving forward. He's got some tough decisions to make. He doesn't want to go back down that road, but Solo and Tama Tonga may have left him no choice now as things move forward with this whole saga that never ends with the bloodline. So let me know what you guys think. What's next for Jey? How do they get there? As I said, there are a lot of different ways they could do it. How do they get to bringing Jey back together with Jimmy? Where does Jacob Fatu factor into this? What's next for Jimmy? Do we see him on SmackDown this week? There's a lot of questions left to be answered. That's what I like about the Triple H era. More questions than answers. And every time you think you've got it figured out, they add a few more questions to the mix. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Always appreciate the great feedback. Hit that subscribe button and like button on your way out, and give me your predictions. What's next for Jey Uso, Jimmy Uso, and the saga known as the Bloodline?